Hey, what's up, guys? We have Paul Gallagher here. He has a leadership and history podcast. How's it going, Paul? How you doing today?
Good, Micah. How are you?
Good. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm just what we would call an amateur historian. So myself and a friend of mine named Richie, we started a podcast this year called the History in Motion podcast, where we cover leaders, but specifically decisions or kind of groups of decisions that they made throughout history. So we've talked about, for example, Harry Truman and his decision to drop the atomic bomb. So we kind of talk through the biography of the leader and how we kind of get to, where they got to make that decision and like what things in their life would lead them to be the person that they were. And it's very interesting because we get to points of like what's in character for someone to make a decision versus what's not in character for someone to make a decision, and like what constraints they're working with. And is it a hard decision, easy decision? What kind of legacy did they leave? So definitely kind of just a history buff, and kind of always been a history buff, kind of reading a million different things as a kid and probably watching every documentary I could get my hands on. But yeah, definitely not a classically trained historian, but very an emphasis on the amateur side, but something I definitely love.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, what's your day job? Because I know you had to work late tonight and then you
Yeah.
started. So I was just curious, what do you do?
Yeah. So I'm an engineer,
Okay.
kind of working in the logistics industry.
Okay, cool. I kind of guessed something like that, kind of like maybe like a computer science
Yeah.
type guy or something, but it looks like you have like a good setup there. But so yeah, speaking of the Harry Truman thing, have you seen Oppenheimer yet?
Not yet, because I've been trying to see it in the 70 millimeter, and every time there's only two theaters near me that have it, and every time the tickets go on sale, they're sold out in like an hour. So I've got to, I think, time it perfectly right and try to get to see it. But gonna try to see it as soon as I can.
Yeah, I think I heard about that like all of them were sold out. Where are you located? If you don't.
Toronto.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, based on like, do you know anything about the movie or no? Or like, is it the type of thing where you don't really want to know anything until you see it, probably, right?
So we did a podcast and we timed it right as the movie came out. So we did one on Oppenheimer. So I'm pretty familiar with the story. Don't know exactly how the movie's going to portray it, but from what I've heard, it seems like it's a pretty good representation of what actually happened. So yeah, I don't
Okay,
know. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm excited to finally get to see it.
cool. So yeah, like what I wanted to go over was, I guess like evil leaders in history. I would imagine that most people would probably are fascinated by, Hitler and Stalin
Mm-hmm.
and Genghis Khan and whoever else, even more modern leaders. So maybe we can start with start at like the beginning and like kind of like move our way forward
Sure.
through the evil leaders, or maybe even like obviously you can go over the good ones too, but
Mm-hmm.
where would you say the start of, I don't know if evil is the right word, but like, evil leaders would begin, like
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, if you go back in time, right, like by modern standards, they're pretty much all evil in the things that they would do. Of you take a city and rape and pillage for 3 days and 3 nights until say okay, that's enough, and half the city's dead, and all the loot of the city is gone, and that's just like, oh, that's normal for a lot of leaders back in the day. But I think one guy that sticks out is if we go back to like the Roman emperors, because you have like really good documentation on who they were. And I think, Nero gets brought up a lot, Caligula gets brought up a lot, but the one that we did a podcast on that was like, this guy's legitimately nuts was Commodus. So if anyone's seen the movie Gladiator, it's Joaquin Phoenix's character. So he would do things like he just didn't care about the day-to-day of the empire, would just spend all his money on being a gladiator and stuff like that. But he would do things where he named all 12, he changed his name to basically have 12 different names, and then he renamed the months of the year based on his name. He renamed the city of Rome after him. He renamed the army after him, the people after him. Like, it's just like ego to another degree, where he's just like, it's all about me. And he would like fight as a gladiator against like wounded soldiers. Like basically people would come out like half dead, and he would just chop them all to death, and just like complete like madness. And then there was all these stories come out of like he threw someone in like a burning oven or something like that. And he would bring like basically like handicaps people to his palace and do some really crazy like experiments on them and stuff. And it's just like, his father being Marcus Aurelius is maybe one of, if anyone knows about like stoicism and like this, he's the ultimate, thinking introspectively and thinking about like what's right and what's wrong, and then his son is just like the complete opposite. So that was an interesting one because you could kind of go from the just absolute two extremes. But I would say, yeah, Commodus is probably like when I think back to, some of the craziest leaders that we can have, like Nero and Caligula come up for sure as having some evil elements to, but I think Commodus was on another level.
Yeah, like in the movie, doesn't he have like Russell Crowe come out there and they like stab him or whatever, and
Yeah.
then he fights him, but then I'm pretty sure Russell Crowe's character like still wins in the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so some of those names were like in the Bible, right? Like I want to say like wasn't Nero in the Bible? I want to say, or
I don't know if he was in the Bible, because the Bible, I think Augustus was the emperor when kind of the story of Jesus was going on. But the thing with Nero is, I think he persecuted a lot of Christians and Catholics. So I think there is a religious element to that, because at the time, Christianity was this fringe religion coming out of what I guess Judea at the time, which is Israel today and Palestine. And so that was starting to move west, and the Romans being pagan, so believing in Jupiter and Mercury and Apollo and all those gods, trying to, those two were kind of coming to a head. And then as an emperor, you're seeing this new sect of a religion coming up, and you see it as a threat. So there was a lot of pushback, and very bloody pushback against the religion. So I don't think it was mentioned in the Bible, but there's definitely a religious connection between Nero and Christianity.
So Nero would have been after the Bible then, right? Like what you were talking about. Yeah, so I think I've heard stories too about Nero like putting like heads on of people they killed like on spikes, and then like as you walk to the city or whatever, like you literally like walk by heads or something like that. Like
I wouldn't be surprised.
True?
And that wouldn't even be crazy for back then, which is kind of as messed up as that is. Like there's the story of Spartacus, which is he was a slave in the south of Italy who gathered up a bunch of slaves and had this slave rebellion. This massive army was just roaming around Italy for years, and it took them a long time to actually catch them and stop them. And then when eventually they did, and this was before Rome was an empire, so this is when they were still a republic, where they won the battle, they crucified, I think it was one slave every like 100 feet from where the battle was all the way back to Rome. So to your point of showing up to the city with heads on spikes, like this is even almost worse. There's crucified men for miles and miles and miles just to kind of set an example of, you don't mess with the Roman Republic if you're a slave and you want to rebel, like this is what's going to happen to you. So, but again, that wasn't even that crazy for the time. It was just everybody is so brutal when it comes to war and the things that they would do, that just kind of what happens. Like the craziness really comes into like the things an individual will do that people at the time were even writing was crazy. Like back then, everyone would be like, oh yeah, that's fine. The slaves deserved it. But there's some stuff like Commodus would have done and some Nero and Caligula that people are like, okay, this is even a little crazy for back then.
Yeah. And don't you think that like you kind of have to be a little bit crazy even now to be like a leader? Like it almost has to be like built in. Well, not necessarily, I guess, because you mentioned the stoicism guy. Like you can be a good leader too, right?
Yeah.
But like you definitely have to make some probably difficult decisions, even if like you're like a quote unquote like good leader. Like, Obama had to, I've only heard of things, like that he, did drone bombings and all that.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, you have to, and same with like you said, Harry Truman and Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to essentially kill people, even if it's not like necessarily
Absolutely
on your hands or like in your own land, even if it's offshore. Like you have to give the, press the red button or whatever and say, let's do it.
And that's one of the things we love talking about is those decisions, right? And Truman's a perfect example of, okay, if I drop this nuclear bomb, there are 50,000 Japanese men, women, and children who are going to die in a blink of an eye, plus tens of thousands more who are going to die from nuclear fallout and cancer over the years. However, doing so essentially stops a war that would probably have gone on for 2, 3, 4 years longer, would have stopped famine throughout most parts of Asia and saved probably more lives. And as we were doing that podcast, one thing we kind of noticed was like, oh my God, we're doing like this human arithmetic of like, okay, if I kill this many people, it's going to save this many people. And it's kind of like that analogy. It's like if you're on a train And if you don't press any buttons, it'll kill 10 people. But if you press a button, you kill one person. So we kind of found that like some great leaders like Truman in that sense would just be like, I had to push this button to put all this blood on my hands. And it's my job as a leader to take that on for the country and for the greater good, despite the fact it's such a terrible, terrible thing to do. But it was really his only option. He didn't really have the opportunity to do anything else. So yeah, it's what makes a great leader is being able to kind of roll up their sleeves and say, I'm going to live with this decision, or I'm going to just commit to this decision and do it. Versus we see a lot of times leaders who will just kind of sit on the fence and not be sure what to do. And then they end up having to make a worse decision because the constraints have changed, or, people around them are different.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing that I don't have is I think I definitely like, I always like will regret my decisions or like feel guilty. I definitely, like I can't stick to something. But so one other thing that I wanted to go over too before we like move forward is the Bible. Like I kind of, as I think also a lot of people probably do, like find the Bible fascinating, and like how much truth would you say is in the Bible? Like yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one to say, right? Because I think we know for a fact that like the Romans were in Judea at the time, and like the Romans definitely killed somebody named Jesus, and then it's like the story around it. And then the question is, how much is written to kind of build the lore around someone like Jesus or Moses or something like that, versus like what do we know is like a hard fact. I think most historians say Jesus definitely lived, was definitely a person, was definitely crucified, and kind of went through that process. Some of the stories around it up for debate. I know there was some debate too around the story of Moses as well. I think there's the story that I think it's the Jewish population of Egypt moves across the Red Sea. They haven't found any archaeological evidence to prove that happened. So some people say, we don't know for sure if it didn't happen, but we don't know for sure that it didn't happen. So it is hard to say, but I think definitely around the story of Jesus, there is a lot of truth to that and a lot of fact. Anything that kind of happens before, I would say, like, from what I've seen, like we get all the details of Jesus in like the last 5 years of his life. And really before that, we don't really hear much till his birth. So I think there's maybe some debate on before that piece, but kind of the last piece is really well documented. So we can probably assume that there's a lot of truth, but it's been a story that's been told and retold billions of times over the last 2,000 years. So, things will change, and you have to just kind of, where your faith kind of lies versus what kind of evidence you can find from, archaeological evidence and scriptures and different writings at the time. And the good thing is the Romans did leave pretty good records of things that happened. So there's some evidence to back it up. But to answer your question, I have no idea. It's just, there's a lot of up in the air on what's true and what isn't.
Yeah. As is with, life in general, right? Like it's like what is true and what's not. But yeah, I actually just I randomly saw this, but I read that like Moses, they think actually probably wasn't real, whereas Jesus probably was. I don't even know if that's for sure. I just like Googled that for some reason, like was Moses real? And so I kind of thought that was interesting, like where it's like, oh, like so they're like whoever wrote it, like kind of took parts, like some of it's fact and or some of it's true and some of it's not. And but also like what do you think their intentions, and I know you're not like a biblical scholar, but maybe, I don't know, hopefully this links into history or something. But for like sure. What do you think their intentions were when writing it? Like, do you think it was some sort of kind of like almost like, I don't want to say money making scheme, because I don't even know if those went on back then, but like that type of thing where it was like, we're gonna like try and get everyone to believe in this, or if it was maybe just on accident, or maybe it was just like a book trying to like teach you how to like live your life or whatever. Like, do you think they had any intentions, or how do you think it all came to be the way that
from what we've seen, at least from reading, not just Catholic history, we've looked at Islamic history, we've looked at pagan history through Roman and Greek. But what we've really found is people really, really believed it back then. I don't think anybody really wrote any of those religious texts for the point of, hey, we're going to use this as a money-making scheme or a way to control people. I think it was one, in a way to explain the world. So you hear the stories of Like the Greek myths, I think, are some of my favorite because they almost personify every part of the earth. Like they'll have stories about like why the stars are the way they are, or why, like, I think one of my favorite ones is why there's seasons. Basically, the goddess of like this, I mean, the goddess of, it's like weather or something like that, or whatever their fancy word for it is. Her daughter gets stolen by Hades, who's like the king of, or the god of the underworld, and she gets really upset. And so her and Hades work out a deal where she gets to go into the underworld for 4 months of the year, but then the rest of the time she gets to come, or 6 months of the year, something like that. And then she gets to come back. And the goddess is really sad during the winter. That's why we have winter, because her daughter's not there. But then when spring comes along, she's getting excited because her daughter's coming back. And then summer's there and she's really happy because her daughter's back. But then the fall's coming and she's starting to get sad because her daughter's going to leave. And it's a really just kind of interesting way of, they don't know that the earth has a tilt. They don't understand the earth revolves around the sun, but they create these stories that get passed down to help explain the world. And so I think that's one piece. And then the other piece is you have just stories about life and about people. And so, if Moses did exist or did not exist, what probably may have happened was there's a lot of stories that may have actually existed, and he kind of was the personification of different things. And then it just kind of became this kind of end story. So I think it really starts with a way to understand the world and then understand people. But then it really does become a way of unification and sometimes a way of control as well. Like we talked about Queen Isabella of Spain. She's known as the Catholic monarch. And her number one thing was, I'm going to make Spain fully Catholic. And she does it, and she unifies the country and is able to get some actual stability and turn Spain into a superpower pretty soon after that. Before that, Spain had a bunch of different religions in the kingdom. So, from, I would say, starting standpoint, explain the world, but then it definitely can be used for whatever tool the person wants it to do. And it's definitely a way of unification and keeping people together.
Yeah. So moving forward, I hear a lot about like, I guess like a lot of it's, I guess like communism and fascism, and
Yeah.
where who were some of the big, I guess we'll start with the communists first, because I think that they were first before Hitler, but like Mao and Stalin.
Yeah.
I guess, could you go into kind of like the history of Mao and Maoism and all that, like the kind of like the Chinese, or just communism in general? And
Yeah.
then yeah. But I know very little about, like, when people talk about, how there's all this like new kind of philosophical talk by like people like
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson and stuff like that about like Maoism, and how like
Mhm.
people today are like, communists or whatever, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Like, like, so where is that kind of like stemming from, I guess? Like,
Mhm.
I guess what would be the start of communism, and then, going into like Mao and Stalin and
Yeah,
all that?
so communism really started with an intellectual movement in Western Europe. So this, when I say like intellectual, these are, PhD, really well off individuals from Germany, Britain, different places like that. And Karl Marx is the most popular. So you hear the word Marxism, and that really comes from
Yeah.
Karl Marx's doctrine. He writes the Communist Manifesto and kind of just talks about how, this is a world where capitalism is really starting to rise. And so previous to this, you saw a world where the nobility and the kings and the emperors owned everything, and the people owned pretty much nothing. And then the church was kind of this like third entity to it. But now we're getting to a point where capitalism is starting to rise. The kings and emperors aren't owning as much anymore. And it's now like private industry is starting to grow. He basically writes this Communist Manifesto with like the main thing being that, greed and everything like that is taking over, and the individual people don't have the actual power. And so he kind of puts this thought together that if every person is essentially equal, is one way to think about it, you're never going to have this like class hierarchy. So one person can do one type of job and another person can do another type of job. And from a, I guess, governmental standpoint, like the government will own a lot of things. So when an industry booms, the government will make a bunch of money and then can just reinvest it back into the society versus it going into somebody's pocket. So that's kind of his idea. And that really moves into the Russian Revolution. And that's where it all starts. So the Russians had, they had something called a czar, which is like their king or emperor, whatever you want to call it. And so he's doing a terrible job. He's lost a bunch of wars. They're doing really poorly in World War I. And so there's a group called the Bolsheviks who basically rally a revolution in Russia and take over the country. And that's where communism really gets its first start. So you have like this, the USSR is created, so this socialist Soviet Republic. And that's really kind of how it grows. And again, like their whole thing is, everybody is kind of a comrade. That's how they say it is. You're a comrade, which means we're all on the same level. But what happens in the Soviet Union really quickly, and this is something that I think is a very fair criticism of communism, is two things. One is, I was talking about the government will control everything and then decide how to distribute wealth. But then the thing is, who is that person who gets to decide? Everybody wants to be that person. So you start to get these power struggles happening. You start to get a lot of backstabbing. You get a lot of political instability. And, around Stalin's time and Lenin's time, you see mass political prisoners. There's a whole prison system called the Gulag throughout the Soviet Union, where millions of people are basically worked to death because they were just put in there as political prisoners. And then the other thing that you see is people who are successful are kind of looked at in a way of they must be cheating the system somehow. The only reason someone gets rich is because they cheated the system. And so what happens in Ukraine is they go after all these really rich peasants who are farmers. And then what happens is you have all your productive farmers are locked up in the gulag. So who's going to create food for you? You don't have anybody to create food for you. So you have thousands, I think millions actually, of Ukrainians end up starving in the 30s. And that's kind of something you start to see with communism throughout all the way up till when it falls, is, you always see like the bread lines in Russia where people are just waiting for bread because all the productive people are kind of suppressed and they can't innovate, they can't build anything. And so that's kind of how the Soviet Union kind of, falls apart. But I can go into Mao a little bit too as well, but I guess that kind of is kind of how it gets started and maybe a bit about the ideology.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of Stalin, and then what was the other guy's name you said? Lenin.
Lenin, yeah.
Was Lenin first and then Stalin?
Yeah.
Or
Lenin was essentially the leader of the revolution, and then Stalin took over after Lenin.
Okay. And then I also thought it was, I probably really shouldn't, but it's like I thought it was interesting that the Russians took from Marx, which is from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
I would almost for some reason think that they would want like their own guy to come up with the idea,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's like I guess they didn't really care that he was from Germany.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the people who are fighting for whatever they were fighting for, I don't think they're thinking, oh, Karl Marx said this. They're really following Lenin in that group. And whatever Lenin, they call it like Leninist or Leninist socialism or exactly what the term is, but it's really, he's taking what Marx is saying and then twisting it in a way that makes sense for him and works for what the Russian people want. So it's not, like we see in Germany where everyone's got Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, on hand, and they know exactly what to do because Hitler said it. It's not like people in the Soviet Union are reading the Communist Manifesto and in Russia are making sure that they know what Karl Marx said. We're going to follow him exactly. It's more kind of a mix on that plus what the Russian people really wanted and what Lenin was pushing in his group of people.
Yeah. And then moving on to Mao, I guess, would that be after?
Yes.
Stalin. Okay.
Yeah. So one thing,
how did that come to be?
Yeah. So one thing a lot of people don't really give credit to, and it's something I'm guilty of as well, is the amount of fighting that happened during World War II in China. So if you look at the numbers of deaths across the entire war, I think it's the Soviet Union was number one. Germany might be number two, but I think China is either second or third in terms of casualties because they've been fighting the Japanese since the early to mid 30s. There's some horrendous violence that happens, but China is a pseudo-democratic, kind of corrupt country at the time, but essentially they fight this really long war against Japan. The Western allies, the United States, Britain, Canada, France are all on the side of China, and they're trying to help the Chinese push back the Japanese. But what happens is, as we know, in May 1945, Germany is defeated. So the Soviet Union have now freed up. And if you look at a map, you have Germany on the Western front, moving all the way to the east. Japan and the Soviet Union are very, very close to each other. So Roosevelt actually has been really pushing the Russians to come help in Japan. So they actually, I think it's in the summer of 1945, invade northern China to try to kick the Japanese out. They invade into Korea as well, which is Japanese controlled. And then they start moving into China, and then eventually the war ends. So that's why we have North Korea and South Korea, because at the end of the war, the Soviets are in North Korea pushing communism and trying to back communist-based leaders, where the Americans and the Western allies are trying to push democratic leaders. And that's why we get the Korean War about 5 years later. Then if we think what's happening in China is China's just been ravaged by this war. The country's in shambles, the economy's in the toilet. People are looking for someone for leadership. And then that just goes right into Chinese civil war. And that's where you have the democratic, and again, I'm kind of doing air quotes here, democratic system that's backed by the Western allies. And then you have Mao and his group that are backed by the Soviet Union. And Mao ends up winning that civil war and taking control of the country. And then that is where Mao really instills this communist view onto China, which exists to an extent today. It's definitely become more capitalist in China than it once was. But Mao, when we look at pure body count, he is number one, and it's not even close. I think he's at like 60 million deaths, or even maybe more. The estimates are all over the place. So there was a lot of famine that happened. He did some like crazy stuff. Like I think he had them, it was like they asked the Chinese people to like start killing like robins or sparrows or something like that for some reason. I don't remember the exact reason, but they did like some really weird stuff of like collectiveness of this is what we need to do as a country. And it was very just, everybody's kind of at the same level. Everyone's needs to kind of do the same thing. And he just kind of ruled with an iron fist, would put these policies in that would cause massive famine. We see a lot of Chinese people die as a result. And it's, I encourage the listeners to look up some of the crazy stuff that he did, because it really kind of is Russia, but like on a grander scale when it comes to just absolute chaos when it in terms of death and political prisoners and famine and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it sounds like Mao was, I think that they were all kind of evil or bad, but do you think there's a part of them that like was originally intending on doing good?
I think so. And the one thing I've noticed with the communist leaders is the way they all got into power was through war, typically civil war, civil unrest, backstabbing, working their way through the system, pushing their way to power through nefarious methods. And every single one of them is paranoid as hell. So I know Stalin, for example, like if you looked at him wrong, you'd be dead in the morning, just because he wouldn't trust you. Like, why keep you around? So I think there's this paranoia element that comes into it too. So they are so upset. They maybe had an idea of, hey, I'm going to do great things, but then they get into power and they're just so concerned about having their throats slit in their sleep, but also just keeping hold of power, and they'll do anything to keep hold of power. And they may think deep down that, hey, if I'm in power, better things will happen than if another guy's in power. Or they're just, I want power because I just have a huge ego, and ultimately, if I'm not in power, I'm probably dead as well. So it also becomes like a survival tactic. And then when you're just trying to survive, all bets are off. So I can't speak for, was Stalin really having thoughts of being a good person, and Mao having a good person? They just messed it up, possibly. I like to think everyone's got a little bit of good in them and they're not all just crazy, but I don't know. The track record isn't great.
Yeah, looking at it now, like, do you think one option is better than the other in terms of capitalism or communism? I guess there's also socialism. Like, what are the other options, I guess? Are those like the main three kind of? Or
yeah, I'd say those are the main kind of three that we see in a modern world. So the way I look at it is like, you have capitalism. Like if you had pure capitalism, you wouldn't have, for example, police force. You wouldn't have firefighters. You would have to call up your private security, or you have to call up your private fire department, because everything is controlled by a corporation. Where communism is, the cars are made by the government, the energy is made by the government, the computers made by the government, everything. And then socialism tries to find that balance. So there's definitely not, one is not better than the other. It's all about finding that balance. Like I'm in Canada versus like the United States. Like I think the United States is a little bit more capitalist than Canada would be. We're a little bit more socialist just because we have like socialized medicine, for example. So I think it's all about finding that balance. So there's definitely places where you want to have more regulation on the capitalist side, but on this, you don't want to have so much regulation that industry is constrained, and then you start to run into shortages when it comes to necessary goods. For housing is one thing that we look at right now, and the government's been very controlling on what you can build where and all that kind of stuff. And now we're running into some shortages. So there's some conversations around like, is it overregulated, underregulated? all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely like a political argument. I'm sure some people will think one way or another, but from what we've seen in history, it's definitely communism does not work. We've have enough history to prove that. Democracy is definitely the best of all the systems. Capitalism has done some really great things, but again, it's one of those things that has to be checked and make sure that it just doesn't run free. And we see that throughout history too, where industry takes over and has way more influence on politics and stuff that it really should, and sometimes it needs to get dialed back.
Yeah, and like, do you think there's like a possibility for like utopia ever, like where everybody's just kind of happy and like we've kind of figured out a way to make everyone happy? Like there, I think I've heard that like, you know, AI is supposed to kind of like um cure capitalism or whatever, or like defeat capitalism. Do you think we'll ever get to that point where it's just kind of like we kind of finally come up with like a good solution to all the world's problems?
I would like to think so, but I've read too many science fiction books that tell me the opposite. So I'm going to go with probably not on that one.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite. The AI ruins us
Yes,
as
that
opposed to
too.
helps us. Yeah. So yeah, going forward into, I guess next would, and correct me if I'm wrong, but next would probably be Hitler and
Yeah.
World War II, right? Can you
Hmm.
go over kind of Hitler and how his his rise to power and all that, maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I think with Hitler is an interesting one because again, I don't. We always say Hitler's crazy and he was a psychopath. He probably was. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't definitely give you a psychiatric breakdown as much as I'd love to. But the thing with someone like Hitler is people like that don't get to power unless there is some, I guess, opening for them to jump into. And the way that works with Germany is we have to go back to World War One. So World War One ends, Germany loses, and the Western powers have a decision to make now. They said, what are we going to do with Germany? The United States wants to be easy on them. They're like, look, we need to help Germany get back on their feet as an economy, because if not, they're going to run into, potentially become communist, or something else might happen. Britain's like, I don't want to be too easy on them. Like, we lost a lot of men. We should be a little bit harder on them. And then the French want to destroy Germany and essentially bury them economically. And so the Treaty of Versailles is signed. And what happens is there's actually a line in the Treaty of Versailles that basically says that Germany accepts full responsibility for World War One. And so for those who know a little bit about World War One, it wasn't just Germany. It was actually Austria-Hungary who declared war on Serbia. And then Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary. And then Britain and France said, hey, we're allied with Serbia and we're going to protect them. And it just was a powder keg that kind of blew up. So now we've put all the blame on Germany. And then we were saying, you need to pay back everything to all the countries for all the destruction that you guys caused. So this puts Germany in, just basically destroys their economy. They have hyperinflation. So you'll see pictures of like people going to buy bread and they have wheelbarrows full of money because the money is worth so little. You'll need tens of thousands of marks to buy a loaf of bread. So the economy is in the toilet. The Great Depression is hitting Germany really, really hard. And so people don't know where to look. Their lives are in ruins. They see no hope. And then a guy comes along and he says, I'm going to fix all of your problems. And we can blame it on some group of people, and that's the Jews. And then everyone's like, well, look at that. That's, if I don't know why all these terrible things are happening, but if we can blame the French and the Western allies, and we can kick the Jews out of the country and do some other terrible things to them as well, that's going to fix all of our problems. And then this kind of mind virus takes over the country where everybody's trying to make sense of what's going on and just kind of starts to see this group identity come of where the Nazi party, German identity, strong Germany. And then Hitler starts to just kind of be more aggressive and starts to push the buttons a little bit of the Western powers. And then he realizes he can get away with it. They're not doing anything. Like, he takes part of Czechoslovakia. They're like, hey, what are you doing? You can't do that. And he's like, what are you going to do? You're going to stop me? They're like, no, not really. No, we don't want to fight a war. Don't do anything else. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to take anything else. And then he'll take the rest of Czechoslovakia like a month later, and then eventually invades Poland, and that kind of creates the war. And the thing with Hitler is, the Germans loved him. They thought he was this savior to the country. But what happens very quickly with Hitler is he doesn't know where to stop. He keeps pushing things. He keeps pushing things. And then as we kind of go back to Stalin and Mao, how they are kind of worried about losing their power. And this is something that happens across history. You can go all the way back to the very first documented leaders. As soon as they feel that they're going to get assassinated, they just something clicks in their head, and they become just more and more psychotic. They're worried about everything. They're paranoid as hell, and they start to just do some really crazy things. And that's when we see with Hitler is right after there's a movie with Tom Cruise called Valkyrie that talks about the one of the times they tried to assassinate him, essentially put a bomb under his desk. It blew up, and he ended up surviving because I think it was like the table was really heavy or something and took most of the blast. But after that, he just starts killing generals that he thinks might be going to plot against him and stuff like that. So it really moves into this direction. And then the whole piece with the Holocaust, I think, is just I don't even really know how you can justify what was going on in his head. It was just this hatred and even disgust for another group of people. And it's like, I need to exterminate them like you would, exterminate like a house that has like bugs or something in it. That's really what he saw the Jewish people as. So again, that's a really just like twisted mindset of you put all the blame on one group of people, and now I take them and turn them into essentially vermin. So yeah, I don't know how you can't rationalize something like that.
No. And what do you think his main reason was? I think that's the biggest question that I always have is like, why, and so many people have gone, after the Jewish people. And I've heard that, like he got rejected by some Jewish person when he was younger. He was trying to be an artist or something. But then I've also heard that like the Jewish people, I guess, were like pretty good at like kind of like creating their own businesses and like kind of like only helping out their own communities or something. But then you mentioned before that like, yeah, if we could just blame the Jews. But yeah, what do you think his main intention was for kind of going after them? One, and then two, a big question that I have also with the Jewish people is, and I know this, a lot of this can like just sound insensitive.
Yeah, I know
Because like almost
thinking,
anything is, you know what I mean? But it's like anything about that subject is. But it seemed like a lot of Jewish people that I know today, they just look like white. You know what I mean? I wouldn't even be able to tell they're Jewish. And it's like, like, is there like, it's like, obviously you don't want to like go against your religion or your ethnic group, but it's like, could you almost just kind of like hide in plain sight type thing? Like where you're like, oh, I'm, just to survive essentially. Like I'm not Jewish or whatever. I guess, how do they make sure that the people were, you know what I mean? I know that, I think I've heard that they put kind of like, I want to say like red something on them, or I don't know what color it was, but like they kind of like marked them or whatever. But yeah.
Well, I know to your second point, just quickly on that, like the easiest thing they would do is Germans would roll in, they would go to a local synagogue and be like, give me a list of names. And you're right, because people would hide. They would take children in and say, oh yeah, this is our daughter. But the Germans are very, very good at their documentation, and they understand like, well, you have birth certificates, stuff like that. So there's people forging documents to pretend that this person is actually part of their family and stuff like that. So yeah, back in the day, like, and that's why it's such a silly concept, is everybody just looks the same and everyone's a human, but for whatever reason, your religion matters. But I can kind of go back to like why the history of anti-Semitism is really fascinating. Kind of sad, to be honest. More than fascinating is throughout Europe, you see just the Jewish, you could call it a race, but really is a religion, but it is kind of treated as a race. I think you kind of have to see it kind of hand in hand just to understand the history of it. Is throughout Europe, you have this Catholic and Christian majority, and the Jewish population is always a minority wherever they go. And so what starts to happen is, for example, in Spain, Queen Isabella, like I mentioned earlier, she kicks out all the Jewish people because she's like, if you're not Catholic, get out. And so people just leave, right? And so there's always this conversation about Jewish people always getting kicked out of where they're from and then trying to find a place to settle. And so eventually kind of what happens is you get these Jewish communities who are really strong because they realize that they need to stick together and be really strong within their communities if they're going to be able to cement themselves wherever they are, because who knows, some guy named Hitler might show up and decide that, you know what, you guys we've had enough. And this is the trend you see throughout history. So the reason like someone like we see like the Jewish population doing really well and successfully is there's a need for it. And if they don't do it, they're leaving themselves open to some higher power from the government or another corporation or something kind of kicking them out. And there are a lot of those companies and different things that kind of grow in Germany at the time that are really Jewish led. And then it's so easy to point to, because it's like, see this company that's run by Jewish people and is doing really well, and you're doing really poorly. It's the only reason they're in power is because of some nefarious, silly thing. And it's just easy to point to because it puts everybody in box A versus everybody in box B. And the box A is much bigger than box B. And box A seems really happy because they can point the finger and not actually have to, really look at the real problems. So it's a tale as old as time. Is just we as humans like to group people, ourselves and other things, to say we're part of group A or group B. And it just kind of helps us understand the world. But it also has a really dark side to it, which we saw in the Holocaust, of this group is the cause of all of our problems. And, the rest is history, unfortunately.
Yeah. And like, were the Jewish people even like fighting in World War II? They were. So Israel was part of World War II, and Jewish people were even within the country where they were fighting back, kind of.
So Israel didn't become a country until after World War II. So essentially, you have Jewish people living in America, you have people living in Western Europe. So there'd be Jewish people fighting in the American army, British army. And then you also have throughout the Nazi occupied territories, you actually have groups of Jewish people who have managed to evade the Nazi and SS and Gestapo groups, and are actually fighting guerrilla wars alongside resistance fighters in those countries to try to smuggle Jewish people out of the country to safety, or to just fight back and kind of run a guerrilla war. So when you really think of the Jewish population, it's very scattered throughout the United States and all parts of Europe. And so what happens after the war is essentially the Jewish population has realized, okay, enough is enough. We need a Jewish state, because who knows if we go to a different country again, and then there's another crazy guy who gets in power and starts blaming us for everything again, we could have another Holocaust on our hands, or we could have something really terrible. Because like the United States had a lot of anti-Semitism, like the whole world had a lot of anti-Semitism. And so that's where you kind of have the state of Israel come up. So it was a British colony. It was the British colony of Palestine. And then a lot of Jewish people moved in, and there was a civil war with like the British and then the Arab states around there. And eventually the Jewish population won and Israel became a country. And it's a really fascinating history, because like it was so close to not being a country. There was so many times where they could have just been steamrolled by the Arabs, but like they just held on just long enough to kind of get things settled, and consistently having to fight back against oppressors around all sides, and eventually started to get help from Western nations. But for the longest time, like America wanted nothing to do with Israel when it first started. They're like, look, we've had enough of war. We want to stay out of it. And so they really were isolated. And it is a very fascinating story about you'll see about American veterans who are coming back from World War II, who are Jewish, hearing about Israel and finding a way to sneak over to the Middle East and actually go fight on behalf of the new Jewish state that they're creating. So it is an interesting story that I'd encourage everybody to look up.
Yeah, so it's like they were fighting, but they weren't really fighting as part of any type of specific country, because Israel wasn't a country at the time. So it was like they were like fighting for America, and they were fighting for different countries. And even within Germany, they were fighting against, like, all the people were fighting against the Nazis, essentially, within the country.
Yeah, they were just regular people, just happened to be a different religion. And you'd have like a battalion in the US Army. You might have a few Jewish people, you might have a few Christian people, you may have some non-religious people. You have a mix of everything. But yeah, it wasn't like we see today where we have like a Jewish state of Israel. Nothing like that existed and was created for, the reasons we've talked about.
Yeah. And so, I'm kind of, and then, there's a thing with like the Jewish people that it kind of like confuses me a little bit, because like they're a religion, but they're also a race. Like I was like raised Christian, but it's like you don't really look at other people and say, oh, that person, I guess you can say, looks like a Christian or whatever. But like with Jewish people, it's kind of hard for me to it's always hard for me to like explain what I'm trying to say here, but it's like there's a certain look they have. And so it's like they all came from like a certain area, right? Which was essentially like the Israel area. around like Jesus's time, but then they all kind of spread out, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah. So Judaism started in Judea, so that would be kind of around Palestine today, and then yeah, like anything, Christianity started there as well, and kind of moved out. It's funny, all three of the big religions really started within like a small area of the world, like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all kind of started the same area, which is just very fascinating, which is why Jerusalem is such an important city and is known as like the holy city. And so yeah, you have a lot of people spreading out, but then you have a lot of the immigrants that come to the United States are actually typically from like Eastern Europe. And then you also have, so there's like kind of like different sects within Judaism. So I'm not really an expert on kind of how they break out, but yeah, you see a lot of mass migrations from Judaism, and the difference being versus Christianity or Islam is Christianity and Islam are more about spreading their religion. So you'll see, Spain comes to the New World with missionaries, and that's why all of Latin America is very Christian. But Judaism never really has that. It's more of a kind of, we're not trying to spread Judaism to everybody. It's more of, if you want to come into the religion, you can, and there's ways to do so, but it's not this kind of numbers game, I would say, that you would see from the other two major religions.
So is that maybe why they kind of tend to look similar, is because they're not trying to get everyone to be like Jewish, like Christianity is? Like,
I'm not really sure. It might just be a lot of people coming from the same part of the world at kind of around the same time, and
yeah,
maybe that's part of it. But yeah, I'm not an expert on kind of those migration patterns.
Yeah. So going forward, and I'm trying to get all this in within an hour, but going forward to, I guess like next would be kind of like Saddam Hussein, right? And then like all the kind of like the Middle Eastern type, the wars in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11.
Yeah.
If you can kind of, I guess, quickly go over all that. And I mainly kind of focused on, I guess mainly focus on, one, do you see the because I hear a lot about how America, when we went into Afghanistan and the Middle East, like we said we were doing good or we were going for 9/11, but really we had like our own reasons. And then, and even like people have said that like we kind of started Al Qaeda or whatever, like we kind of like turned these people into, we kind of made these gangs come about because we were there, I guess, right? These groups. So yeah, I know that's kind of like a lot. And then if you could also cover what's going on currently between like Israel and Palestine, is that you also hear about that. It's like, it's kind of like I quote unquote like want to be on the Jewish side, but then you hear like Israel is being very mean to Palestine, but then Palestine like almost like a bully to Palestine. So I guess to summarize it all, if you can cover like a lot of what's going on like in the Middle East. I know that was a lot, but I'm trying to like get to that, and then ideally get to like our current state of leadership.
Yeah, I think with kind of what's going on today, it's still hard to know for sure. Like, it's very interesting. A lot of the stuff we research, we find out that like something was, so a good example is we learned a lot when we did the Harry Truman episode about the Japanese government, and there was documents that were like released in like the mid 90s from the Japanese government and declassified, and from like I think after the Soviet Union fell, and you got all these documents that came out, and you learn like, oh my god, that's actually what was going on. So it's hard to say for sure kind of who did what and who started what today, because I think we'll know if we have this conversation in 50 years when all of the documentation and secret messages and stuff are declassified for public consumption whenever that date does come. We'll know a lot more. But I think with the Middle East, it's one of those things where there has been, I think you have a lot of colonialism kind of in the area too, with the British kind of being involved. That kind of helped destabilize the region. You also have two versions of Islam that kind of are competing against each other as well. So you kind of have like proxy wars happening, like Iran versus Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. And then when it comes to like leaders, like I look at someone like Saddam Hussein, and we see it through history where when things aren't, I guess I can even go back to like Machiavelli. So Machiavelli was a Renaissance writer, and he basically wrote a novel that talked about how to be a great leader. And if you had a choice, would you rather be loved or feared? And he came to the conclusion and said you should be feared, because if you're feared, No one can overthrow you. You can stamp your foot on people if you really need to and keep power. When you're loved, you might be seen as weak and someone could take over. Obviously, you want to find a balance between the two, but he's like, if you had to choose. And so someone like Saddam, where he's in an environment he's got, he's just fought a war against Iran. He has Israel to deal with. Saudi Arabia is getting very, very rich off oil. The Soviet Union's pretty close by as well. American interests are in the area. For him to kind of keep control, I think he sees it as, I need to rule with an iron fist. Didn't work out well for him in the end, but I think that's just kind of a common tactic. And I know, again, we'll find out more about, I'm sure as time goes on, about who Saddam was more as a person and like what the US was really seeing with him and what the Western powers were seeing and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's really hard to say, I think, at this point, just because we don't know for sure all the interworkings of what was going on inside those governments.
Yeah, as far as the Machiavelli thing, I mean, I kind of almost got I don't really, obviously, you know way more about him than me, but when I hear the term Machiavellian, I almost think of being like sneaky or almost like political,
Yeah.
where it's like, I'm to your face being nice to you and like, but really I'm trying to like get something from you.
Yeah.
Would that be the overall idea from him, or would it be more of like just try and be as like feared as possible?
Yeah, I think you could say kind of the interworkings of a political maneuver. If it's, you may, if even on the surface you're being very nice and very friendly, but the guy you're talking to knows that if you say the wrong thing, you might not wake up the next morning, or you may be exiled or something like that. So there's definitely that element to it. Machiavelli kind of covers a lot of different topics, but that, is kind of his main one. And that term, from like a psychological standpoint, is kind of grown throughout time as that piece of what he's saying of, you really do need to be feared.
Okay, so yeah, I kind of thought it was more of almost like a fake nice thing, but it's really kind of like, I remember like watching Breaking, it just came to my mind watching Breaking Bad, and I don't know if you've seen it. I'm assuming
I have,
you have, but yeah.
Yeah.
Walter White, I think it was the part where Walter White was like maybe threatening or something to like poison the kid, or he did. I don't even remember, but it was like that really messed up part. And whatever was going on, my friend was saying it's like Machiavellian or whatever, where it's like, you're kind of like you just said, like you're like, or what's the term that like one of the presidents used, like speak softly but carry a big stick type thing, where it's like you want to make people fearful of you, but you don't want to be like obvious about it, I guess. Like you just want to be scary, kind of. Yeah.
It's like kind of that you're kind of very kind of calm and collected with your emotions, but really in the back of your head, you're kind of scheming a little bit, or you're sitting in the corner of the room and just kind of watching everything happen. And you're kind of maneuvering while, the people who are yelling at each other, you're like, okay, I know what he thinks. I know what he thinks. I know what he thinks, but nobody knows what I think. And that's like a classic kind of like political standpoint. Like if you're in a negotiation room back in the day and you're the one that's just kind of sitting and listening, nobody really knows what you're thinking. You could be scheming. And that's also why Stalin, with Stalin, there was always a thing. If you spoke too much, he thought you were arrogant and cocky and he would have you killed. If you didn't speak enough, he thought you were scheming and would have you killed. So everyone was trying to find this balance of, okay, I'm going to say a little bit and then I'm going to stop talking. So Stalin knows that I'm not overconfident, but I'm going to let him know what I'm thinking so he doesn't think I'm scheming.
Yeah. So as far as the whole 9/11 thing, us going there after and then kind of staying for so long, and I've heard stories about how we were like, but I don't know if any of it's true, but it's like how we supposedly were there. So I've heard stories of how we were there for like drugs, like heroin or something. But then I've also, there's like the truthful aspect, which is like we were really there because 9/11. Then there's like we were there for drugs, or it was like we were just, or it was like we were there just to try and keep peace, or maybe like try and get them to actually like get their shit together and like, I guess you could say like globalize or whatever. But it's like, what do you think our true intentions were with that?
It's a great question. Yeah, I have no idea. I think nobody knows. And it's one of those things. And again, I can just give historical examples of there's always an incentive. There's always everybody who's got their hand in a pot. Everyone's always trying to find a way how they can gain from a certain event. And sometimes people go in with great intentions and it ends up just being a terrible place or a terrible decision. Or they just come in with, hey, we're going to steal everything and run off with a sack of gold. And that's just the way it's going to be. Yeah, I think it might be one of those things where you go in with good intentions, but then, special interests get involved and different things happen. But yeah, I don't, I have no idea, but I will be very fascinated when I'm an old man and I hear the, you know, documents about the invasion of Afghanistan have been declassified. I'll have a lot of reading to do because I think that'll be when we'll learn a lot.
Yeah. And then so moving forward into I guess now maybe like Israel and Palestine, I think it's like easiest, like like when I said evil before, it kind of is like a maybe a dumb word to use, good or bad, but everybody I think kind of wants to know. I think everybody wants to be on the good side, right? And it's like
Hmm.
who's correct in that situation? Is it Israel or is it Palestine? Obviously, there's probably really not maybe a true answer,
Yeah.
but what's going on there now? Like, do you personally feel like one side is, um, you know, doing more wrong to the other side, or is it just kind of a back and forth war that's been going on forever? And
Yeah. It's a story as old as time. I think fighting over the Holy Land, right? It goes all the way back to, Roman settlements there and, Jewish rebellions. And then we go back to the Crusades and, fighting over Jerusalem, the Muslims and the Catholics and the Christians and everything like that. It's just that area of land will just, it's never seen peace and it may never see peace, unfortunately. You definitely can't say one way or another that one group is right versus another. I think from a political standpoint, you say, hey, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But, for a lot of Palestinian people, that's been their home for thousands of years. They've lived there. Their grandparents have lived. Their great grandparents have lived there. And like we talked about, there's a lot of Jewish people who have moved there and kind of moved their way into certain areas, and then you get kind of battles between, whose land is this really from a legal perspective, a religious standpoint, and so it's really all about point of view. At that point, I think the only way forward there is both sides need to figure out a compromise in some way, but that goes against kind of you've been fighting a war for 75 years to kind of just say, hey, we're good and we're going to draw the lines here and move along. So definitely can't say one side is right versus another, but I think it's just that's that part of the world, and for whatever reason, I think just the multiculturalism of all the different religions saying that this area is our holy land. It just, I don't know, it brings something out of people that it becomes so important. And for, we talked about the Jewish people, they needed a home of their own after World War II, as we saw, but the Palestinians are rightful to say, hey, we were here first. We say, when I say we were here first from like a country perspective, but then you can go all the way back to, like I was saying, the Roman times, and the Jewish religion is older than the Islamic religion. And then it just becomes a whole nother thing. So again, where do you draw the line? I have no idea, but I definitely wouldn't come away with this saying one side is right versus another. It's an unfortunate conflict. And I think it's just that part of the world. And it always seems to be at war in some capacity.
yeah, it kind of seems like when you, as like, especially probably from like a historical viewpoint, like you're very good at being like unbiased. Whereas I feel like nowadays, we get into the whole one side is right, one side is wrong. You got to
Yeah,
pick sides type thing. Well, I'm sure that's how it's always been, but
for sure.
recently it's been more of that. But so in terms of the Holy Land, real quick,
Yeah.
what exactly makes it the Holy Land? Like, is it the fact that everything that happened when Jesus was there, or does it go even before that to like the I guess like Moses and all that? Like, I mean, how far back does that go? Even Abraham? Like, I mean, it's just
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know about Moses and Abraham exactly if there's like a specific location around Jerusalem that's considered, but I know the Temple of Solomon was in Jerusalem, and that was like the first big Jewish holy site. So you just had a lot of Jewish people there. You had the high priests were there. It was a major city within Judea, which was the kind of the region at the time. And then Jesus comes along and he happens to be in the region as well, himself being Jewish, but then also creating this new religion that spreads from that area, the apostles moving out of that area. And then I don't really understand how this seems to happen, but Muhammad, who's the founder of the Islamic religion, is also from there. And there's kind of a story that he ascends into the afterlife out of, I think it's the Temple of Solomon, which ended up becoming a mosque, all within Jerusalem. So these core stories of these three major religions all just happen in Jerusalem. And then so many different factors saying that, if the Christians are the ones to own this, we're making God happy and the Pope is happy, versus the Jewish people are like, hey, wait, this was our land first, so we want to be here, where the Islamic people in the area are also fighting against different things. And it's just, I think just from it's just very interesting how kind of just all three kind of start from a very small area in the Middle East versus, didn't happen we don't see it coming out of China, which was like one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world, or really starting in Rome, where everybody's kind of a little bit more sophisticated. It just all happened there. And it's just kind of fascinating. I don't really know why, but it just kind of did.
And it happened to be within that exact city of Jerusalem, right? Like that's what's,
Yeah,
it's not even like the area, right?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I would say Jerusalem is the main, like in the Islamic faith, you have Medina and Mecca, which are in Saudi Arabia, which are also very holy cities, but Jerusalem also has a very huge religious, I guess, element to the Islamic religion as well. But again, Mecca and Medina are not far away from Jerusalem. They're all kind of within that neck of the woods. So, and
was Jerusalem like the biggest? That's probably part of it, right? Jerusalem was probably the biggest city at the time, so everybody probably just maybe I don't even know, but everybody kind of like flocked there, kind of like now it would be New York or LA or whatever. Like,
yeah, I'd be interesting actually to look up like why cities are founded is always a fascinating thing of just like, it was a trading post or it was a military outpost or whatever. It wasn't the biggest city at the time. Like you'd have cities like Rome, you'd have Alexandria in Egypt. Some of the Greek cities were quite large as well. Even some of the Chinese cities got pretty large, but it was definitely a major city. It was under, we look back at the Crusades, it was, under siege for months because it was such a large city and took a long time to take. Huge populations in there as well. So yeah, there's something about that place that just, it just kind of brings the, peak of religiosity to all the people around the world.
Yeah, for some reason I'm like interested in that is an interesting thing, is like what started the city. And I think like Las Vegas, for some reason I've always kind of like wanted to like a deep dive on the history of Las Vegas. I heard that about it, where it was like it started as literally just two like roads maybe, and then like like you said, a trading post or whatever, and then next thing you know, it's this huge like gambling mecca in Nevada. But so lastly, and then we'll wrap it up, in terms of current leadership, how would you say that is going? Like you obviously you got Trump. I mean, I feel like the world kind of almost, it seems like this looks to America. It's almost like you have other countries like talking about America's politics. Everybody is like Canada, and so it seems like the big one would be like Trump, Biden. You got and then you got Trudeau in Canada. So and then I guess if you want to go over any of the other ones too, I don't know if there's as much evil stuff going. I mean, there is, and I was going to say earlier, I kind of feel like I once again hate to use the term evil or bad or good, but some of the worst stuff seems to be coming from the Middle East. And it's like, in terms of them, so you hearing about them throwing gay people off of roofs, or making women wear masks or whatever. But if you want, you can just go on the current state of politics. And I guess like where do you think things are going from here? I mean, to me, it looks like a very good trajectory of an upward trajectory in terms of humanity in general.
Yeah.
But some people don't think that way. Some people think, we could blow ourselves up soon. So
it is always scary when countries have nuclear weapons and stuff, and somebody could just press a button. But I will say, like, just from studying history, we live in the best time ever, and it's not even close. People will say, oh, remember this time and that time. Like, how connected we are today. The level of poverty is so much lower all across the world than it's ever been. And there's obviously still a lot of work to do, but we're way better than we ever were. But I think, when we look at like leaders today, you look at Trump, Biden, Trudeau, whoever it is, I think the big thing that's changed, and we've always seen it throughout history, is it's all about your PR, how you can market yourself. doesn't matter how good you are as a person. So we just did a podcast on the partition of India and a specific individual named Louis Mountbatten, who was essentially a royal out of the British royal family. And, he was loved back in the day and everybody kind of loved him. But now it's starting to allegations are coming out about some kind of more sinister things. And we kind of learning a little bit more about his decision-making abilities. And we really looked back on, he had a PR team just for himself back in like the 30s and 40s. So, he'd get articles in the newspaper. He would, go talk to different people and all these sort of things. And so it all comes down to really how you can, have your PR and make sure you kind of control that narrative. And that's always been the way it's been. And, we see today, Trump having his rallies. It's like, that's the oldest playbook in the world. You get people listening to you and you can control that narrative. And we see it, one of the interesting ways is the way the Roman emperors would do it was they would print coins and they put their face on the coin and they would say something about, or they have like a little inscription about like something that they did, because that was really the only way to get, there's no printing press or anything back then. The only way to get information was everybody's got money and they can look at it and go, oh, that's the guy who's in charge. Well, he must be doing something right. And I'm going to say that's, I'm going to follow this guy. Where today, obviously it's much more grand than that. So I just think the way public relations has changed and now we just have so much more to go off of. But yeah, I'm pretty optimistic on, where the world is going. And I think just we have, the 24/7 news cycle and all that kind of stuff is just so different than anything that's ever happened in history. Like the concept of news is a very new concept. You may have had the town crier back in the day saying like, hey, we're at war. This is going on, but it talks for 20 minutes and that's it. It's not like that instant information we have today, but I think, I'm optimistic of where the world's going. And like I said, from a historical standpoint, it's never been a better time to be alive. And yeah, it's kind of just something we got to be grateful of and, try not to get hooked into the, some of the doom and gloom that we see today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think a big part of that is technology. Like my girlfriend has said, oh, you're just talking about technology, but there's so much other stuff like politics. But I kind of feel like technology is such a big part because not only does it make our lives, and people can disagree with this and say it makes our lives worse, but it also connects us. Like you said, it connects us in a way to where everybody, you no longer think of some other country as like, outsiders or whatever. It's like you kind of realize that we're kind of all in this together. And some people are doing maybe not so good stuff, but it tells you to like love your neighbor, not hate them, even if they live far away or whatever,
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah. So and then lastly, I'll just ask you, what do you think about are you in tech? You said you're an engineer, but are you in tech?
I used to work in tech. I'm back in kind of like the logistics world now, kind of trucking and warehousing, that kind of stuff.
Okay, what do you think about all the tech? Speaking of technology, what do you think about all the tech stuff that's going on? Real quick, Elon Musk, stuff like that. Like, you mentioned the PR thing. Like, do you think he's intentionally kind of doing this almost kind of like outrageous PR stuff with X and Twitter? Like, because a lot of people are like, dude, what is he doing? Like, this billionaire is going on X or Twitter. I don't even know what to call it now. But do you think he's just like a genius for what he's doing, or like, do you think that he's just kind of like riding the wave of like success, or like what with him? Do you think? And I guess the tech world in general, maybe.
Yeah. Well, the tech world's going through a big kind of shift, and just they had a lot of money for a long time, and now they're realizing that, having low interest rates and really high margins is not going to last forever. So I think they're trying to shake up a little bit on how they do business. But with Elon too, I think like he's absolutely a genius. Is every decision he makes a genius decision? Probably not. Do I know what the heck he's doing? I have no idea. I'm trying to even think like from a historical standpoint, you have guys like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, the once in a generation kind of super geniuses. They're never totally, I would say, sane when you listen to what they say or what they write. Like I think Tesla had told the US government that he was building a machine that could, I can't remember what it was, like some like giant death laser sort of thing. And everyone was like, oh my God. And it was never going to be a thing, but he's a super, he's like the mad scientist type. So I think Elon's kind of in that camp. He's the mad scientist with a lot of money and access to the internet. So maybe a little bit of a new kind of vibe on the technology world. But I think it's an exciting time. I think like, Chat GPT and all that kind of stuff is really changing the way we're going to work and live. And do all these sort of things. And it's going to be, I think, interesting from a historical standpoint when we look back on, we talk about the printing press being a huge thing that was created because now anybody can write a leaflet or a letter and, mass produce it. Where today now anybody can post on the internet and all that kind of stuff, but now they can post and do all of these things a lot faster, and sometimes without even having to do anything, just writing in like, hey, write me an article that tells me why Biden is better than Trump or Trump is better than Biden, and make it really, clickbait material or something like that, and people can just start pumping that stuff out. So yeah, it'll be a very interesting time from again, we go back to the PR standpoint. It's going to be very interesting.
And do you think it keeps getting like better and better, or are you like kind of like an optimist when it comes to AI and tech? Or are you kind of like scared of it?
I don't know. Like I'm excited because I'm always excited by the newest thing kind of thing, but again, I've seen too many movies, so you never know where things can go. I'm more worried about us not knowing what's real and what's fake. Like you're already seeing things on Twitter today. There was like a picture of it was like the Pope wearing like a big puffy jacket. Everyone's like, oh, cool. Look at the Pope. He's wearing this fun jacket. And then everyone's like, actually, that was an AI generated image. And everyone's like, oh, so now I have to question every image that I see online, every video I see online, or before, if you saw a picture or video, it was most likely real. So I think there's going to have to be a kind of either a point where we understand it a little bit better, but then also from is it going to get better? There's always a diminishing return at some point. But with AI, it's like when it can start training itself and kind of iterating on itself, then that's when things get scary, and you have to kind of think, are we going down the Terminator road here or something?
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned like Elon Musk is like a genius. Some of these tech leaders, I mean, do you think that they're just kind of on like a different level in terms of genius? Like Sam Altman and those types of guys, maybe even, I guess, I don't know, Tim Cook doesn't really seem like a genius to me, but it's like they're playing some sort of like 4D chess or something. Like,
Yeah.
Like it's hard to compete with them type thing, or do you think that they're just kind of like maybe just like working harder, or just luck, and just happen to come up with a good idea?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of everything. So again, I always have a historical example I can give. So one is Werner von Braun. So he was actually a Nazi scientist who was taken by the Americans after World War II and actually worked for NASA and was huge in the Apollo programs and the space programs. But he was considered one of the greatest engineering managers of all time. So he would be like a CEO of one of these big companies today. He was not the best engineer. He was not the best physicist, definitely not the best rocket scientist, but he was he knew a lot, obviously, about all of those things. Like he had his PhD and things like that. But everyone said he was phenomenal at just getting really smart people together and getting them to do amazing things. And so we look at someone like Tim Cook. Yeah, maybe it doesn't strike you as a genius, but he's clearly has a skill to be able to bring a lot of really smart people together and really work within that environment and create some really great stuff, where you'll see maybe someone like Sam Altman, who's kind of got a smaller team, and maybe, I don't know what his kind of role is, kind of how he runs his company, might be more on that like genius side where he really knows the nuts and bolts, versus someone like Tim Cook, who may not be able to take an iPhone apart and tell you exactly how it works, but he knows how to get the people in the room to design it, get the manufacturers to design it, get the marketing team to work well together, get the logistics team to figure out how to get all the parts together and make it all work into one kind of cohesive unit. So yeah, I think it's kind of a bit of everything, and it all depends on size of company, what they're actually doing, and what their ultimate output will be.
Yeah. And I think Steve Jobs was probably like the best at that, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. But yeah, so lastly, I usually ask like if there's any movies, TV shows, podcasts, especially music, and then obviously like your guys' podcast. And one I wanted to ask you about that you probably know about is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. Have you listened to that one at all? Yeah.
Oh yeah. A couple of times, we'll say.
Yeah. It's hard. I tried listening to it a while ago, and it was hard for me to get through it because there's just so much going on, Yeah.
Yeah, you really got to be in a state of mind for something like that, because he goes really in depth into a lot of some topics. And again, he's the king of, I think, when all history podcasters look at him and say, like, he kind of set the standard for what a really good history podcast is. But to your point, like, there's now a good mix out there. So like some I could recommend is like obviously History in Motion podcast, which is mine, which I think is pretty great. So definitely check that out if you're looking for leadership in history. One I really like it's called The Rest is History. So it's a couple of British authors and podcasters. They do more like 30 to 40-minute episodes, and it's a little bit more quick paced, and they're really smart and they know. I don't know how they can fit all that information in their brains, but they're pretty great. And then one that I really liked as well, it's called the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, and so he's got like 160 episodes, and he starts right from the founding of Rome all the way up to the fall of Rome. And he kind of has like 20-minute episodes where he kind of goes into individual things, and it's a really, really great overview of every part of Rome. And you can kind of pick different parts of if you're interested in, the time around like Jesus's time, or if you're interested in like Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and that whole kind of piece, or you're interested in the fall, you can kind of jump around. So all pretty cool stuff to listen to.
All right, cool. And yeah, I heard recently about one called like the History of the Third Reich or something. I don't know if it's a podcast or like a documentary. Have you heard about that one? Or
it
the
might
fall
be, yeah. There's so many of anything to do with World War II, and especially with Germany. I feel like a million podcasts and documentaries out there. But to be honest, I'm a sucker for that stuff, so I'll probably end up watching it, whatever it is.
Is that mostly what you listen to, is history podcasts?
Yeah, I'll do history, a little bit of politics, sports, the Wall Street Journal. What's it called? It's called The Journal. It's like 20 minutes every day, and it just kind of gives a little bit of like some current event that's going on. So they were talking about like the affirmative action ruling in the Supreme Court was one today, and then about there's actually a trucking company in the U.S. that's been in business for 99 years and just went bankrupt the other day. So little things like that, and it kind of keeps you up to speed on what's going on in the world. And I like it because it doesn't get too political. It's just, hey, here's what's going on. We talked to a few people, so it's not like super biased one way or another.
Yeah, just the facts. So yeah, once again, thanks for coming on. And I know it's late out there, and I know you have a partner too that you do your podcast with. So if you guys ever want to come back as a team, let me know, and I'm sure we could dive into one specific subject. So
yeah, that'd be great, Micah. Yeah, he's on vacation this week. I would have loved to have him here with us, but yeah, we can find another time. And yeah, we had a history of the entire human race to talk about, so we're definitely not short on material.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, guys. Talk to you next time. Bye.